I wanted to touch on Autopilot. Yes. Okay. So, does everybody know what Autopilot is? Yes? Some, to some extent. So, Microsoft's Autopilot is the user experience engine of the world. It's also a compliance engine. It's the place where essentially, if you define this asset when it touches our surface, it is going to do X and it's going to be brought into Azure Active Directory. It's going to be set up this way. Here's the parameters it's going to follow. But it is database number 2 in our journey. And it's a database where you can either predefine the objects, whether that's coming from your distributor, so Ingram Micro, Dell, Direct, whoever it may be, can populate the hashes, the cryptographic hash of this operating system and its hardware into a database that means, hey, if Windows sees this when it gets connected to the internet, do X, right? Onboard it in the following manner, provide the following user experience. It's how you get Dell to ship directly to your client and have them just simply set it up to internet and walk away in an hour and a half. They have everything they need, right? And so it's that user experience model. So let's walk through Autopilot's database real quick. So we'll go to, I know how to navigate to it through here. So we're going to go through endpoint. Devices, Windows Enrollment, and then down to, it's because I'm zoomed in. Normally it'll look a little different for you guys and gals. It'll be zoomed out some, so it'll be this way. This is what you'd normally see. I'm zooming in for the ability to read it a little bit, so it's going to look a little funky. So the Autopilot part is on the same place as the enrollment for MEM, for Microsoft Endpoint Manager. But we're specifically talking about this segment, Autopilot Deployment Program. And so when you go into your devices on Autopilot, this is where any device that is ready and known to this system to be ingested when it sees it goes, right? And so you can set policies that when devices join Intune or MIM, they will automatically populate their hashes in here from their live hash when they're running their cryptographic hash. What I'm going to be demonstrating is a method to grab that hash if you have not gone through a distributor program. Through a flash drive, when you're booting up the machine, you can grab that hash and then ship it out, and it'll follow those instructions as it goes to set up. The irony is if you already have access to the device, you probably would just set it up right, for the user. But if you're buying 100 laptops, you want to grab all the hashes and have them to be able to be populated in through to your users, you can do that as you sell them and distribute them. And if you're using Dell, though, you can actually have them pre-register. When you do it in Dell, they'll bring it to your partner center, and then you can bring it from Partner Center into the users. So you actually start at partner.microsoft, not here. But in this case, we're going to be demonstrating the main hash-based method and user-based methods, not the device coming from a distributor method. So just know that this is a separate database. You have to search it by serial, which really sucks if you build white boxes, like for my kids' gaming machines. Like, it's a real pain. They're just blank. The serial is blank, and it just says no serial. And so you have 100 no serial devices. That's not great. But if you're buying a Dell and it's got a service tag, that's what's going to be in here. And so you would just search by that service tag. You can't search by name. It doesn't know a name. It's an object. It's just a hash that should be this device. If I know this hash, comes up again. And just for edification, hash is just some mathematical problem you apply to something on a set number of variables that will always be the same outcome, given the same set of variables. And so this is a hash. Yes, sir. Yes, star. Where that is a lie is if the TPM is not asserted the first time and you grab a hash, when the TPM gets asserted, it's a new hash. It has new hardware. So short story, 99% of the time you're not going to run into that problem. But if you ever have one where you're like, dang it, I've already registered this thing and it's not here, you could have had someone turn on the TPM and it becomes a new piece of hardware in there. So just know that that can change it. I don't think adding other peripherals changes it. It's really just that one core systemic, I have a trusted platform module or not as part of that calculation. So, because part of that hash tells Microsoft this has a TPM 2.0. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. If anybody's ever been ingesting hashes, when you bring that hash in before the device has ever been seen, Microsoft will determine whether you can use device hardware-based enrollment or not device hardware-based enrollment. If you don't have a TPM 2.0 certification, you're only 1.1, 1.2, you can't do hardware-based enrollment. And the reason for that is when you're doing hardware-based enrollment, it is bringing a cryptographic representation of the user with it and storing it so that it can do the user setup stuff out of the TPM before the user ever signs in. We're going to demonstrate that today. But I know that the hash includes that because when you bring in the device and it'll say, oh, that device doesn't have a 2.0, we can't assign this profile that's hardware-based. And so we probably won't run into that because both of these do have TPM 2.0s, and almost everything new hardware is going to be a 2.0 specification. So if you're buying new hardware, you can do hardware-based. It's also a requirement for Windows 11. Windows 11 requires the ability to store those user objects in the trusted platform module in a cryptographic way. So if they don't have it, they won't allow it. So ran into that one for a little bit. That was fun. But yeah, Autopilot. See if I can one Alt Tab. What? When? Okay. Endpoint Manager. Yeah, the meat of Intune is Endpoint Manager. So let's look at that real quick. So endpoint.microsoft.com is your endpoint, pun intended, I suppose. And it is what houses most of what we're going to be working on today is in endpoint.microsoft. It has, in this endpoint manager, it has reference to devices. This devices is Intune devices, not Azure devices. So your Azure Active Directory objects are brought over and represented in Intune, but these are different objects. They're a different database. They are 3 separate databases. So this is database 3, is the endpoint manager's database reflection of the devices that is in there. The users are all one database. They're all stored in Azure Active Directory, but devices get stored a few places, unfortunately. So Windows, this is where you would go into and talk about the different settings. We're going to focus on Windows, not Mac and not Apple. Sorry for my Mac friends here. But we're going to be focusing on the Windows side of this. So in Windows devices, in the Endpoint Manager, you have your Windows enrollment. This is actually a referential object back to Azure Active Directory. So if we click on this, we'll see how do I configure my MDM and what would be in the scope of MDM for your conversation earlier, ma'am, and then also what's in MEM, in the Microsoft in the mobile application management. The difference between MEM and MAM is that MEM, you usually use that when you own the device. When you're going to own the device completely, you're going to have all control over the entire device. You're going to have all control over what goes on that and how it's configured. Whereas MAM is mobile application management. That's how you have somebody that does a bring your own device that doesn't want it to be fully managed by Intune, but they want Outlook on that phone, or they want Outlook on that device, or they want those, and you could set walls around that the application has to follow to store its data and have access and all those things that's application-centric and not the entire device-centric. So when you have that privacy person that's concerned, MAM is a methodology to use for specific applications as well, but just know that these are both defined in Azure Active Directory. And if we go back to Azure AD, that was DS. If we go back to Azure AD, we will find mobile device management here and the similar pages for the information here in Azure Active Directory, the references here. So in our case here, we're using all. We'll get into this here in a little bit when we start the lab, but I would recommend setting up a group and restricting the MAM ingestion scope so that you can just test, right? If you still have a local domain back at your office and you're still not completely absconded from that with that, you could just set a user that you're going to use, and that's what I'm going to be doing for these devices, is setting up a user and restricting this group down here in a bit. But this is your MAM settings for that, and then back to Windows. So you'll notice that when you start, and they used to include applications in the Windows devices. They've now separated apps off to its own little segment on the left there, but Windows devices, you're basically set with compliance policies. And compliance policies are going to be, is this device compliant? Is it encrypted? Do I have the things I need to have for it to be good? And it's going to show whether that device is compliant. Why that's useful is you can make conditional access policies say, yeah, not only must this device be joined to Azure Active Directory, but it also must be compliant. And if it falls out of compliance, do the following behaviors. Send the user this, do this, take away access. So that you can start making an automated compliant story when you're starting to adopt frameworks, when you're starting to go down the SOC 2 journey or CMMC journey or ISO 27001, what have you. It allows you to use these policies to kind of reference that, yeah, they can't touch the data if they're not compliant. It's built into my policy. They just can't touch it. So that's why those matter. Configuration profiles. This is AD. This is GPO. Right? This is, if you think about traditional GPO, configuration profiles and PowerShell scripts encompass that configurability. Right? So and I won't get into all of these, but take some time learning what all you can do, because there's tons of things you can do in here from a setting perspective. I heard somebody talking about this earlier today. You can set up automatic setup of OneDrive and automatic redirection of folders to OneDrive. And you can start making it to where once that device comes up, it starts getting built. It starts getting configured. You start saying redirect and sign in as that primary user into Azure AD and sign into OneDrive as this primary user and redirect this and do those things. And as the device becomes available for the user, all of these things just pre-exist for them. And their desktop comes back and their documents come back. And as long as you have the applications there, then they all meet in the middle and they're functional. So configuration profiles. What you cannot do with configuration profiles, you can do with PowerShell. And there's some interesting things I might get into if we have enough time of ways to cheat the system with PowerShell. These scripts run basically once, right? So if you have something where it's trying to solve a goal, that's not very effective. What I've done in the past is use W32 apps that contain PowerShell payloads that if this changes, then run this again. If this changes, then run this again. So somebody uninstalls software or installs some control tool you have, you could set up a W32 app to treat it as if this has been uninstalled, even if it was a settings change, and then have it rerun that PowerShell script and then check to see if it's changed. And if not, rerun it again or bring up an alert to the admin. So for this, though, when you think PowerShell scripts, this is the native way, but really think ran once at setup or at the beginning of the ingestion of that device into Intune. It has no ability to continue checking if that PowerShell is functional, if the elicited change out of that PowerShell has been elicited. But with W32 apps, you can actually check for this file. Yes, sir?
Would you have to basically make a PowerShell script into a executable to do that?
Short story. So what you end up doing is you use the W32 app, and you actually you can use batch files to launch the PowerShell, and then you actually say, okay, after this batch file and PowerShell have run, tell me if this file exists in this folder. Tell me if this setting exists in registry. Tell me and if not, say that it failed. And now you can say, oh, this app failed. No, a setting I needed to do that needed to exist and wasn't in the templates is how you do that. So I did that for my device logon for Duo, right? I needed it to be real time and always there. And so with W32 apps, it's constantly checking. And so if somebody went and uninstalled their Windows login, it would just reinstall pretty instantly, minute or so, minute and a half, something like that. So your attack surface is short. But yes, good question. You don't have to make an executable. Because what you're thinking of is the Intune Win packages that we're making. That's what makes this ingestible. There's an executable you run to take this folder and package it all up into an Intune Win file. And then you bring that in W32. If we get time, I'll touch on it. If not, I gladly demo too as well, because this is how you bring your PowerShell to real life, in my opinion. Yeah, Microsoft's missed a big window on this with how they implemented PowerShell, in my opinion. Update rings. This is the answer. Like, I do not, at Iconic, on my 400 or so devices, 170 employees, we didn't use an RMM. I didn't have a single RMM in my entire, for my internal people at all. And the reason was I used this patching, and my patch problems went away. I just turned it on. It is very effective at Windows 10 patching. The update rings is beautiful. Feature updates is beautiful. Quality updates, maybe not. But the features and main update rings are great. You would just set a policy and say, listen, do this patch. And you would say semi-annual channel, Windows Insider Fast, and they each have their descriptions. You can go look them up as well. If you do this, you'll have Windows 11 here pretty quick. So learned that lesson on my kids' machines. They were really pissed. Their games didn't work well. But yeah, so you just have to be careful with it. But you can basically, and it goes back to that defensibility. Mr. and Ms. Klein, I didn't just set up something and do it. No, this is Microsoft's best practice. They run this. Now, Print Nightmare, you'd have been very unhappy, right? Some of those Print Nightmare patches were nightmares. And so they would have been pretty quick. So yeah, just understand that. But it's defensible. I can say, I follow Microsoft's best practice. You want to go to the semi-annual channel? We'll move to the semi-annual channel. But that becomes defensible, right? And it always just works, especially if your Azure Active Directory joined. Hybrid gets a little weird, but it could be a very solid strategy for patching for your clients if they're willing to go down the modern journey. So let's leave patching. Feature updates, this is essentially where you would create a profile to take them to 21H1, 20H2, right? Yes, sir.
Do you delay by days, so many days, or just immediately when they come out?
Yeah. So for my 170 people, there's a different answer than our 20,000 humans. But yeah, on the 170, they just ate it. They didn't like me. Yeah, I was really ugly. We just deployed instantly. We were on the fastest channel. Again, I learned the Insider Preview pretty hard lesson, but we didn't delay. We deployed for our internal assets because I was trying to meet SOC 2 Type 1 and then ultimately Type 2, and I really wanted a defensible patching strategy that I could say, listen, as soon as it's out, I'm patching. But anything you set, even if you did set a delay, is defensible. You're saying, I want to be able to test patching. I mean, Felicia, my friend, is really big about that. And I agree that from a scale perspective, you should look at your patches, you should test. And so setting a delay would be defensible. So, good question. All right. So I think that's kind of the basis of this first piece, Endpoint Manager. Is everybody familiar with Cloud PC? At the time I was affiliated with it, it was Project Deschutes with Microsoft. It was under, in fact, every time we'd meet about it, they would flash this thing that said, listen, we will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law if you leak this. Like, if we can criminally, if we can money-wise. And so Project Deschutes was a early adoption of Cloud PC. Cloud PC is this, basically, if you think about Intune, endpoint management, and a physical device, Cloud PC is the way to bring that into a always available, always ready virtual machine that you really don't have much control over in two different iterations. There's one that's Deschutes DMM, Deschutes MEM managed, and then Deschutes self-service, DSS. So with DSS, you just assign a license. It's $40 a user, I think, or $35 a user, something like that. And they get a 2-core, 8 gigs of RAM machine that's booted off of a golden image. So you could actually, let's say you had a complex EMR, that you're using, or I pick on those guys because the medical people are terrible. But, if you have something that's really complex to install, you could take an image of that, bring it in, and then when the Cloud PC boots up, it's got that imagery already done. And so a lot of the install work that you can't script could already be done, right? And so you could already have some of that capability in an image. And it's basically, in Microsoft's mind, it's for the very small business to be able to just spin up their own stuff, get a license, and not manage it. But if you think about that in our world, frontline workers, things that are those kind of like very low need, but need access in a way we can control, very good way to access that. And if you combine it with DS in the DMM, or whatever they're calling Cloud PC with MEM management, you could actually have it connect back to a local VNet and have access to a server running in Azure or a server across the VPN or through an app proxy in that cloud machine, and have it be it's just going to be this. And if you want to reset it, the user can reset their own machine. Reset, brings it back to factory, goes through the MEM ingestion process, comes back up, and it's back up and accessed. So I'm going to show you guys MEM or CPC today. I have a CPC spun up. That's what you're looking at here. This is the customer side. So Windows 365, that's what they're calling it now. Sorry, guys. Sorry, been through the iterations. But yeah, Windows 365 was Cloud PC. In fact, you can still type in cloudpc.microsoft and it goes to Windows 365. They just rebranded it when they launched it publicly, so I apologize. But I spent about 2 years with them on the advisory of that product. But essentially the user, I'm a user here, not an admin. I'm actually coming in as a user consumer of this, and this is my box. VSB policy with it's just what it got named. It would be named something nicer if you did it for real. In fact, you could just call it, Matt's box, Matt, CPC, whatever. And then that just names it here. But it tells you your specs. It lets you get a link to open it. You can reset the machine back to factory as a user. So, I'm having problems, reset. Like, man, every time I reboot my machine, it takes 3 hours. They're probably clicking reset. So you want to be careful of that. It's a big difference. Microsoft and I have gone round and round about that being right there. But yeah, the users can do the management of this stuff. They can access it in the browser. They can access it through a remote web. And we'll kind of get into that hopefully later. I'll demo a little bit of this once we get through the meat of what I wanted to cover. So Cloud PC was something I just wanted to touch on. It could be a very viable strategy. If you've ever looked at doing WVD, your incremental cost of WVD are probably pretty close to the same cost as this Cloud PC when you get done with it. So without having to have any of the infrastructure. It's just on Microsoft side. And in fact, when you use it doesn't matter, the user consumer side of this, your egress data, thank you. Man, you were awesome. I did need that. The user side of that, their data goes out through Azure without you being billed. But if you're using MEM managed and you're going through your VNet, you could have data costs, right, as that user's internet is coming in and out of your VNet. With this model, it's unlimited. There's no cost. So if you can go the route that doesn't need access to on-prem resources, that doesn't need access to Azure resources over a VNet, there's no cost for the data in and out. And it's at I think you get like 5 gigs a second or something. It's ridiculous, the speed. So if you have somebody in rural Iowa that is that's using a horrible connection, it's just like RDE, right? It's like RD Web. You're connecting into a machine, and it can have 5 gigs a second throughput to their SaaS app. And so you actually could see a way where you could make a much better user experience with that and have no data ingress and egress costs. So the web version's okay of this, and it's not fantastic. But what to note is that when you're using WVD, when you're using CPC or so bad, I hate their marketing department, Microsoft Windows 365, you're signing in through Azure Active Directory, and so you're on a platform service. If you're on a platform service, you have a BAA. So it's not tied to Active Directory, it's outside of a BAA. It's not Azure proper where you are not in a BAA. If you're using Azure proper, you can't sign a BAA because you can misconfigure it. They won't sign it. It's not part of the EULA. But if you're using platform services like Office 365 and Azure AD and Azure AADDS, those are all covered under their BAA. So you have a very HIPAA compliant kind of story to tell there. This is under BAA. Yeah, the one you'd have to do would be you're configuring VNets, you're hosting these machines yourself in Azure, you're creating, and they're actually kind of blending it because they're going to bring images into this too. So you normally could only use the images in the MEM managed version, but they're going to bring images where a administrator could set up an image, and then when the users go to consume that image, it's already got all their software in it. It's just not there today. But anyways, but this is Windows 365 MEM. Or non-MEM managed. This is just a cloud PC instance. I'm paying the $35 license for it, and I now have access to a machine that is a remote machine, not branded with PAX 8 logos, but it's definitely I'm cheating the system. I don't want to pay for my own lab. Don't laugh at me. It's terrible. Yeah, but this is my cloud PC that I'm using for my Matly in my test lab, and so you can also access that through the endpoint client as well. It's much cleaner, in my opinion. But yeah, so I think I just signed out of Microsoft. I quit. Whatever. But that's Cloud PC and Windows 365. This is just the nomenclature. We're not in the labs yet, so I apologize. And when I say Azure, sometimes I wanted to just touch on that when I talk about Azure proper, it's what I use to help my people understand the difference. It's not what they call it. I just call it Azure proper. You're talking infrastructural. And so it's back to that AADDS instance where you're going to have a DS instance that's your domain controller that is your, for that machine. But you might still have to spin up some Azure proper resources, right? You might still have to have a database server and a front-end IIS server that's going to run, and the legacy models running that EMR. That's what I say Azure sometimes comes into this concept for modern. Yes, sir. On what? Cloud. They did. They did trials, and it was so much consumption they didn't have enough hardware bandwidth to cover it, and so they cut the trials off really, really quick. Did anybody get a trial when it was live, Windows 365? It was like that. Yeah, they're hopefully going to revamp the action pack. They're kind of like, and you got to understand, Microsoft is so segmented. Everybody's kind of got their own missions, and so the challenge is instead of them having this unified vision of let's drive people to modern, you have like hundreds of departments fighting for that. Action Pack's not one of the ones that's in that modern kind of. I mean, they only just recently added business premium licensing, right? So I think last year. So I did my silver last year at Iconic. I was like, what? I got 25 business premium licenses out of this? This is great. So they just changed that. I don't know if it's a specific. It does. Yeah. We. Oh wait, silver partner. Sorry, I'm so wrong. Silver partner, not action pack. Thank you. Yeah, our silver partner changed to have instead of the E3 licensing, moved to the business premium license. Correct. All right. So now I kind of wanted to get into our lab side. So I should have a license sitting here free. And does anybody want to take a break? We're an hour and a half in. Does anybody need to take a temp break, or are we good to keep going? Okay. All right. Let's do it. So we're going to go ahead and create a user and a group. So the first thing we have, I want to make sure that somebody didn't snag my license that I've had sitting here for a couple weeks. Settings. This would be where I would ask you guys to participate along, because we're going to create a group to restrict Intune or MEM ingestion. We're going to create a users group, and then we'll ultimately create some device groups as well. I promise it's not the COVID. This is the dry cough here, gents and ladies. All right. Do I have a license? I guess I'll find out when I go to add a user. So we're going to add a user, and we're going to say test user, T user. Is our T user here, and we're going to create a password. So should be good. So we're creating a user. You guys will maybe already have a user, but I'm creating a user for sure. And we're going to give it they added more licenses. Business Premium. I don't have any more licenses of Windows, but I did want to illustrate. So see how when I'm assigning my licenses, there's a Windows Business 365 2 vCPU 8 gig RAM 128 gig. That's where those Windows 365 licenses will appear. And so you just assign them to a user, and as soon as you do that, it starts building the VM for them in the background. It starts creating all that stuff based on your policies. So this is where you would assign that, and what that starts making you realize is, wait a minute, infrastructure becomes a checkbox now, right? Like I just click this box and they have a machine that they can sign into, and it's really scriptable too, because you can create that user through your, your provisioning software side. So, yes, ma'am. Yeah, yeah, great question. My devices, they always will have right now a CPC in the name. And so you can set up some dynamic device groups to do Intune ingestion based on the name being CPC. That's what I do. So that way, when you spin that device up, even though no user has touched it, even though nobody's actually gotten into it yet, it'll see that the name's CPC and start doing some things of installing software for you inside MIM. So that's kind of, Microsoft didn't realize it. It was funny. I was in advisory with them, and we were talking about it. I was like, they were saying that you had to either choose DMM, Deschutes MIM Managed, just it was the project name, and then DSS, Deschutes Self-Service. And if with DMM, you could use MIM, you could use all of those things. And I said, guys, I think you're missing something here. Like, I can do that here just by naming and group device, dynamic device groups. And they're like, we want to see this. And so we've had some, it's just funny watching how disjointed they are, right? Like I laugh, but short story is, yes, you can, it always puts CPC in and then some algorithmic part of Matt Lee, the username in for the CPC. So I'll show you that when I get back there again. So we'll create our user, no administrative access. This is just going to be a core user. This will be your frontline worker receiving a laptop. That's what we're trying to illustrate here. So we've got a password, no admin, great. The other thing we're going to do together is let's go set up a group. So in the same Microsoft 365, and I'd probably just do it in Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, if you're playing along at home, and groups. And I used to make this group called Intune Users Group, and so I'm going to do it again, but let's do MIM. That way they don't get mad at me. And we're not going to make it an Azure AD role assignment group right now. That's something we'll deal with later if we have time. And then the members will create Mr. Test User in that, or Mrs., I suppose. Non-gender specific in this particular case. So we've created a group, and what we're going to do with this group here in a little bit is we're going to make this group be the group that you have to be in order to be pulled into Intune automatically when I see you. Why is that important? So my sales director, Nick Nyberg, or VP of Sales, Nick Nyberg, went home, signed into his machine at the house, and we took over his machine, right? Because he signed into his home machine in Outlook, in Word, in some thick application, and it says, hey, allow Intune to manage this device? Check, right? And when it happened, I installed SentinelOne. I installed my stuff. I encrypted his drive. All of those things that allowed me to tell a story to a compliance auditor that I don't care who you are or where you are. If you touch my data, I'm going to have access and control your system. Now, fun fact, I don't know if you guys know Machine Logic. Nathan from Machine Logic came to me with a challenge. He says, Matt, I have this machine that they're locked out of. They don't have access to set the password. Or as administrator, they're a user. They can get in, but they can't do anything to the machine. We really need to get that fixed. And we don't have access to the Active Directory domain, right? All this stuff. And I had a hunch. Go register it in Workplace, right? And then set a script. And so, sure enough, you can sign in as anyone in that worker school and use that as an attack method, right? I can take over as an admin just by simply registering worker school and having Intune then take over that operating system and do stuff to it. So if I come in as a regular user, I can priv-esc, essentially, a privilege escalation via just using Microsoft Intune with my own separate account somewhere, right, that I just keep for that purpose, 7+1 labs, let's call it. So just understand it's very powerful access, and that's why I'm advocating having it registered. You can't register it to multiple places. So once you have that in and it's AAD registered or AAD joined, then you can't have someone else come in and insert their capabilities through that path. So you heard it here first. It does work. It's a great attack surface. But yeah. So groups, created a MIM users group. So now we're going to go back into endpoint management. So endpoint.microsoft.com if you're trying to follow along and do this. We're going to go to Windows Enrollment. And then automatic enrollment. And so they already had this to all. For the purposes now, for this class, I'm going to set a group. If you go in and set this MIM users group as the group this is now assigned to, now just anybody signing into a Word isn't going to get sucked into Intune while you're testing and learning as an MSP in your own org. So setting a restriction on this MIM ingestion to a group lets you say only this user that I wanted to be brought in, whether it's your own user, whether it's a test user you're using, will get ingested in based on scraping as a user. What I mean by that is on this laptop, we're going to demonstrate just signing in as a user and having it get pulled into Intune. versus a hash-based methodology where it's coming in based on its hardware ID and identification. So we'll save that. I'm just going to leave my MAM scope as all. We didn't use MAM heavily. We owned the devices. We didn't let people use that, so my knowledge space is a little short there, so I'll just apologize with that. But MAM is an effective application method. There's a lot of people that can really do much better at that. There's some good boot camps for that as well. But I'm going to focus on the MEM joined AADJ full pure modern experience side. So we're going to save that to set the restrictions. We're not going to sign into anything real quick so that we don't get the Azure replication delay. But if you guys are just turning on this setting, it'll work once it's set. So has anybody used this enrollment method yet, or these new settings on their tenant that we're doing today? If you're already using it, awesome. Everybody else that's going through this lab, has anybody else already had this set to all, or is this just now getting set? Okay, that just helps you know the replication for Azure delay time you have to have. Right now, if they've never been set, it'll either work or it won't. If it had been set, it could be wrong. So, awesome. So we're going to save that and set it to that group. And let me look at my notes here. Which one I wanted to do next? User join to group. So we added the user to that group, right? Yeah, you guys saw. Did we do that already? When we created the group, we already added the test user. We did. So you could always go back and add more. So if you're starting to expand this across, like you're going to do your field text next Thursday, and you're going to do your help desk the next week, or clients as you iterate them through, like you want to make sure the devices are ready. What we would do is we did a sysprep on the system, left it the way it was, but when it was joined to the domain with all their software, did a sysprep. And then when we came up, we used test disk to bring them back to their profile, and we would just one by one move the users into the MEM managed user group so that when they reset and came up, they were in Intune. And so you could do that instead of making it this like haphazard, some of them are registered, some of them are joined. You're only getting joined ones because you're only moving the user as you do the reset. Security group. Yeah. The difference, the delineation being that the 365 groups make a mail account as well on the other side. They get into more like the Teams side of things on that, but this is pure security play. Great question, thank you. So, yep, security group. You can use the other for certain things. Right. What you can't do, if I remember correctly, is dynamic groups inside Microsoft 365 groups don't function. So the stacking of those was a challenge. So I think we ran into that. All right, so we're going to go, and we're really kind of running pretty quickly. So endpoint enrollment settings. So we're going to do a group-based enrollment. So I have, no, you don't want to see that. Nobody cares about that. So we have, my test user is in a group, right? So we've added it to that MEM resource group, and we have our device here. So we're not doing a hardware-based deployment. So I'm not going to grab a hash. This is just going to be someone opens a laptop and the OOB experience, the out-of-box experience, right, from Microsoft, it's native. If you're not OOB, you can, as an administrator, so if let's say you're signed in as Matt Lee on cni.local, my old domain, I can go in as that administrator, launch command prompt administratively, change to sysprep, cd space sysprep, and then type in sysprep and just don't generalize. Generalizing in sysprep takes away drivers. It causes some real problems. So you don't want to generalize. You just want to do a regular sysprep, and it'll bring you back to an OOB state like this. So if you're thinking through a conversion to take your users from domain join to AADJ without having to reinstall, go completely clean, get rid of all software, all those things, if some of those things are things you want to keep and make this transition a little easier, then you can do that by sysprepping a live machine. It'll keep all of its stuff and settings and installed software for the most part, and then rejoin to that profile after you've made it AADJ. Test disk is free. It's by Forenzit, Forenzit. But it allows you now to do AADJ user profile as well. So it actually is native AADJ. It will let you say, yep, that's Matt Lee at iconicit.com, and assign that profile to that old CNI local profile. So they come back to their same experience. The technician has all their stuff and their putty pieces there, and all their stuff they're used to is still there. But anyways, yeah. So let's go ahead and just join this one. So what I want to do is after the group-driven enrollment, I want to set up some policies so we can actually see it happen on that next hardware device one. So we're going to do just a simple user join on this one, and then we'll go back through on the hardware-driven enrollment. As we were talking about earlier, this is kind of a point where you could either follow along right now with your other device and actually go ahead and sign in with user, or you could wait until we're done with all the settings, setting up some config profiles, setting up some software to install, all of those things, and then grab a hash of that device and then sign in with a hardware-based methodology if you have a TPM 2.0, or you could do it now and sign in with user. So either way, you're going to get the same outcome. It's just a different, maybe if you wait a little later, it'll have more impact as you do it. But all right, so I'm going to sign in. So I should have switched to that device, and I have a handy-dandy keyboard here, and I can see that device as well. So let's sign in. So we're going to go ahead and get it some inner tubes. I bet the FBI free Wi-Fi is a good one to join. Never a bad thing. I'm going to do a hotspot just because the CAPTCHA in the hotel, you're going to have a hard time getting internet right now. That's why I asked you guys to bring a couple different sources, because if you're doing this, you may not be able to get internet from the hotel. You could spoof the MAC address and then register it on another device, and then it would work. But let's turn on personal hotspot. That's all I found. Connect automatically. FBI van is always free. FBI van is always free. All right. So once we get internet, because this isn't hash based right now, so where it's saying, hey, we have some new important setup to do, it is talking to Microsoft. It is saying, here's my hash, here's my information. And Microsoft can usurp the next steps in this process if it knows the hash, right? So if this device belonged to Iconic, when I'm doing this, before I've ever told it anything about me, I haven't said anything. I haven't told my name, my username, nothing, just signing up. It's going to say, wait a minute, we know this device. We're going to go ahead and bring it into Intune. So one of my first failure points would be if I have somehow not removed this fully from my other database, it may suck this back into my personal Microsoft 365 here in a minute. So we're going to see. But it should at some point bring me over to asking me for a username and password and whether I want to set this up for work or whether I want to set this up for personal. But it's looking like I might have screwed up. We'll see. I had these in my home tenant, and I removed them to do this work with you guys. So we'll find out if I have to fix this. Anybody else doing a test device right now? I know there's a couple people that brought some. No, I just meant, is anybody doing that right now? I'm trying to confirm if I'm being sucked into Autopilot right now or if I'm waiting and I'm going to be up to sign in just a sec. They change this order every now and again. Okay, good. I did successfully remove it from all places it existed, so that's awesome. So this is your normal workflow, right? We're all used to this. Set up for an organization, next, which means the user can't screw that up, right? When you ship this to their house, they got to make sure they clicked on the setup for organization. If they click on the other, you got some challenges to fix it for them. And so this is the user-based sign-in. So we're going to say test or tuser at 7+1labs.com. And then we're going to give it a password and sign in. So this is user-based autopilot deployment. Focus on, or AADJ. We'll get to autopilot in a little bit. So now once I sign in, it should realize that I have an autopilot profile, and it should start taking it through the preparing your device for workflow. And what controls that, we'll get to here in a minute, and I'll show you the settings, and we'll walk through all of that, is your autopilot deployment profiles and your device join. And so this is the autopilot deployment profile. This has successfully gotten into autopilot, and it's doing the things we've set up, asked it to do. And you can control this behavior. You can say, go ahead and let the user sign in as soon as we get these things in, but not these, right? Like your antivirus softwares, your compliance story conversations. But maybe if you don't want to wait on this other application that takes forever, you can say, no, don't make them wait on this. And we'll get into kind of where those settings are here in a little bit. But this is the autopilot experience by user. So as long as the user gets internet, signs in, and sets it as an organizational device, you're golden. We can reduce that to none of those variables, right? We can reduce it to, if this device shows up, do these things to it. And then the user doesn't even have to sign in and put in a password, which means that you can start doing user-based policies on a user not being present by assigning that device to that user and doing those things. So we're going to let that kind of just work in the background. It's basically just going to sit there and say, waiting on the first step to finish, preparing your device for mobile management, working, and then it'll go in device setup and then ultimately account setup. So that's that TPM 2.0 that will come into play later. But today I gave it a credential. So it didn't need that to be stored cryptographically ahead of time. So it's going to do those setups, and then it'll just dump the user to their device being fully set up. Let's go to, not that, never that. I don't know why I even put in a picture of me. Okay, so Other mouse. Let's go into where some of these settings are controlled while we're waiting on that. So when you go into your devices in Microsoft Endpoint Management, and you go into Windows, and you go into Windows Enrollment, there's a few things we're going to want to look at. So Windows Hello for Business, is everybody familiar with what Hello for Business is? It's essentially Microsoft did the face in that. They also have U2F and FIDO in that. But when you're talking about authentication, there's three types of authentication. There's type 1, type 2, and type 3. So type 1 is something you know, right? Type 2 is something you have, and type 3 is something you are. So a fingerprint, a retina, those are something I are. Something I have would be a FIDO token, a U2F token, a PIN on my phone, my Microsoft Authenticator app. Those are all something I have types of authentication. So when we talk about MFA or 2FA, we're just saying some combination of these three components more than just one. Something I know is my password. Username is kind of assumed as an identity factor rather than something you know. But it is also another something you know. But when you're talking about multi-factor, you're saying, okay, I'll also add a push notification. That's something I have. I have to have this phone. It has to be able to go off. I have to have my handy-dandy U2F FIDO token or a few of them that I own. And in order to sign in, that's a normal type of authentication in MFA. Windows Hello is actually interesting because some people will say, oh, using a 6-digit PIN is a bad idea on my sign-in. Maybe. Because it's something you know, but it's something you know that only works with something you have. That something you have is a TPM 2.0 chip that's storing that piece. And so you're not sending your fingerprints. You're not sending your face to Microsoft. It's being stored in the TPM. And the assertion of whether that's your face or not is being checked in the TPM. And then an assertion that it is checked is sent back through to Microsoft. So just understand when people are like, oh, I don't want to give my biometrics away. That's not how that works. They're stored in your TPM. They're not used any other way than a cryptographic yes/no answer. So just that's what's neat about that, though, is now if I have this pin, a 4-digit pin in this, you've got to pry this out of my hands. The pin doesn't work somewhere else. It doesn't work without this. It's only when paired with this. And so in my opinion, these type of tokens, U2F, FIDO, even with a simple pin or even a simple pin to sign into Windows, actually meets a higher standard for two-factor authentication than even a long password that's being checked against a Microsoft directly where they're storing it, because it's now stored physically in this device and you have to have this device. But people can argue me that to the death on that one. I get it. But Windows Hello is a great way for you to set some of these user experience type sign-ins where if Matt Lee's standing there was a really cool attack yesterday that came out in the news. Essentially, you can fake Hello by getting an infrared camera. It's a third-party infrared camera and a one single infrared shot with a black backdrop because anyways, side tangent. But Windows Hello is usually more secure. But anyways, so CNAME validation, I had you guys check that earlier. That's just saying, hey, will my device do this? If it public DNS, will it say yes to these things and give it the data for endpoint enrollment? And then the enrollment status page is kind of what we were staring at before. And so what's this one that Dominic created? But let's dig into the enrollment status page. Actually, I'm going to do it from a new setup. Bear with me, guys and gals. So we're going to create, and this is going to be Matt delete me as the enrollment status page. And do you want to show app and profile configuration process? So remember that screen where I could check, show more details, right? That's what controls this. You can say, no, I don't want to show those things. I don't want to show progress where they're at. I would prefer yes, usually. This also lets you say, if you're setting up some complex softwares, it lets you give you an escapement point where if it goes longer than X, this down here says continue anyway, right? So you could set some parameters with this to say, if it goes longer than 60 minutes, let the user escape through that. Yes, sir. Yeah. Windows enrollment. And so I'll just go back to it real quick. So here, Windows under the left, and then Windows enrollment, and then automatic enrollment. The top one is where you set that group to say yes or no. And when you come in, you'd go to some and add the group. These are all default. They're the Microsoft enrollment, sites that it's going to take it to. If you were using a third-party MEM solution or MDM solution, like whatever, there's tons of them. But if you're using one of the others, VMware's or IBM's, you could set those enrollment sites, and it would present that data to those enrollment sites. But here we're specifically talking about Microsoft being the MDM in this case. So, all right, so let's go back to our handy-dandy Windows enrollment status page, create new, Matt, delete me. If I was smart, I would have done that in another tab. Not though. Settings, show app configuration profile, 60 minutes. Show custom message. So this gets, yeah. This is default canned. So whenever it gets to that 60 minutes, the default canned is installation exceeded time limit set by please try again or contact. But then it says continue anyway. Like this word really screws people's up. So I would definitely change this to say, please click continue, or something. In bottom right hand corner, whatever. But otherwise it just says, oh, it's failed or this. No, it could be something completely unrelated to that. And that statement tells the user, this must have just exceeded time. No, something got hung up or it was the wrong. Yeah, so this is what they get to see when it gets to 60, regardless of how it gets to 60. So it doesn't give you very much data. So just, I always change that. Log collections there. Yeah, so this is saying if you come in and scrape the surface and join, I'm not sure how you'd be able to present a scenario where you're not an OOB and still going through the ingestion like that. So that's what it's asking. This is if you have some compliance policies, then you can say, I will not let the device go continue forward unless certain things are installed, unless everything it succeeds and installs. There's a way in the hardware-based, I believe, that lets you. Yeah, this is where you'd go to selected applications. So if you're doing Windows installs, you can say block device until these apps are installed. So the default would be all apps are installed, but you could say no, selectively, I just want to make sure Sentinel-1's on, or I just want to make sure Threat Locker's on, or I just want to make sure, right? So you could actually set some selectivity into whether you let them continue or not. We usually used all, mainly just because I wanted to be iron fist about it. Assignments, and so you can actually give different experiences for different people. If you have someone doesn't have access to sensitive data, and you don't need to meet a certain requirement for the install, you could set a different enrollment page that says, no, frontline workers that don't have access to sensitive data, as long as they got Sentinel-1, we're good, just continue. But if you have someone that's accessing CUI and you need to tell someone in a CMMC world, or CUI, anybody can make fun of me, I go CUI, it's just easier to use. But if you're using CUI, you might want to tell a compliant story that says, no, they cannot access CUI until they have all these protections in place. Well, how do you know? Well, it won't let them even continue. They can't sign into the device. The device is restricted. So you can set that. In this case, we're just going to apply this to all users. Oh, no, I have a group I made, MEM, just for the heck of it, so I can clean up later. So I'm going to assign this to my group specifically, which is my test user. Scope tagging, you can get into some unique ways to apply this with scope tags. I don't think scope tags ends up living in its current iterance. It's a pain in the butt to use. But it is a method to say, I want to scope this to this tag, and I'm going to apply this tag multiple places, and varying things will happen based on where that tag is used. And so it's kind of a challenge, but it is a way to further kind of set parameters around, I want to just do these devices and this user, but not this device and this user. The challenge is some of these devices don't exist yet when you're trying to do scope tagging, so you can't use that as a method. It can get complex, but scope tags are valuable. There's a really good article on how to use them as well that Microsoft wrote. No scope tags for this. This is just going to be a generic page, and you'll find they're in order of operands. And so if I'm in this group, which is presumably all users, and I'm also in Matt Delete Me group, you can grab these three dots and reorder the priority, if I remember, right? Isn't that what you do? Yeah. And so you can say, I want this Matt Lee group that's only going to include this test user to be first. That way, if the test user also exists in a more open group, then it's going to follow this hierarchically like a firewall, right? It's going to say from top down. So it doesn't go by more restrictive. Like some firewalls auto order based on more restrictive, so the more restrictive policies fall at the top, and then you have to do that manually. So it's just a helpful note there. All right, so there's our enrollment status page. In addition to the enrollment status page, when you start getting into Autopilot, right, because this is me enrolling. I'm manually enrolling as a user. I'm going through the enrollment. It's going to follow the enrollment status page only. But when you get into Autopilot deployment profiles, you have to set some different things. And so this will be a Windows PC Autopilot deployment profile. I just want to make sure you're following along with me, sir. Are you good at where we were on the Autopilot enrollment page so far? Yes, sir. Windows enrollment, and then this is the specific generic Azure Active Directory enrollment, automatic enrollment, not Autopilot. Okay. And then after that, the enrollment status page, which is still part of enrollment. Okay. Awesome. So Now we're going to get down to when we're using Autopilot. So we're going to say, I want to set a experience when I'm using Autopilot. You can do a HoloLens if you've spent that $5,000 or $3,000 or whatever it is. I have not. Or a Windows PC deployment profile. And we're going to call this Matt Delete Me as well, just so that way people can make fun of me later when I didn't delete it. This is so critical. Like if you are trying to convert existing objects into Autopilot, this is massive. So what this is saying is if I set a group on this that's subject to Autopilot, and let's say I called that, an Autopilot devices group. In fact, let's make it. That was one of the things I was wanting to demonstrate. So I'm going to be smart and use my own tab here, AAD.portal, and I'm going to go create a group for devices. New group, and I'm going to create a security group, but I'm going to make it a device group, and we're going to call this MEM devices, just for my own purposes here, and it's going to be assigned. Let's say you had a lot of stuff in your Azure Active Directory because they've already scraped the surface, your users are using Word, they're signing into it as their Microsoft account. If you set up an Autopilot enrollment page like this and say all devices in this group, I want them to be brought into the Autopilot database, then when those devices are live, when they're on the internet and they're talking to Microsoft, Microsoft will run this get hash in the OS that I'm going to show you on a flash drive and ingest that hash into the Autopilot database. So if you notice, my Autopilot database was completely empty, right, earlier. And that's because none of this was set up. But if you set this up, it'll actually take live devices that are scraping AAD's database, database 1, and bring their hash over to the Autopilot database. So that if that device was sysprepped, you wouldn't have to type in a user. You would just see that device and see that it's part of an Autopilot deployment profile and go ahead and bring it into Autopilot. So does everybody follow that? I'm sometimes use bad words. I don't get, but essentially it'll preemptively prepare your devices for being sysprepped and brought back into Autopilot down the road, instead of having to have it be built as you bring them into Autopilot through the normal enrollment or manually gathering the hashes. I didn't want to chase down 300 hashes at Iconic, and so instead, whenever we were bringing on people we bought, we would just simply put their devices after they scraped into AD into a group that was part of the Autopilot deployment profile, even though it had never come through Autopilot. That then forces Autopilot to build its database with those serials and the hashes. So just know, and we might be able to even demonstrate that here in a minute, but because I'm building this group now. So in the enrollment side, I did create the group. Okay, so I won't restrict this to a group right now because I want all of those devices to show up in hash so I can demonstrate this, but you would be able to say, I want this profile to be only applicable to these user groups, because you might have tons of stuff in your AD that's useless, right? Or AAD that's useless. And so you might not want to use all devices come over, but we'll get into that here in a second. So deployment mode. In this Autopilot deployment profile, I'm going to leave this one as a user-driven. No, I'm going to go ahead and do this the other way. Normal model is user-driven. So meaning what we just did, if I sign in and I'm a user and that device is in the subject of this scope, then it's going to go ahead and, if it has the hash, bring it in through Autopilot with user-driven. The new model, and Microsoft marks the things that might bite you with parenthetical preview, right? So if you see parenthetical preview, can punch you in the face. Just know that's Microsoft saying this is beta-ish, right? It's a little better than beta, but it can punch you in the face. So self-deploying requires a TPM 2.0. I think it even says that here. User-driven devices are associated with the user enrolling and the user credentials required, or self-deploying devices are not associated with user enrolling and the user credentials not required, because it is bringing that down to the TPM and storing it in the 2.0 protocol. So in this, when you do self-deploying, you get less choices. So just for the purposes of talking through these, I'm going to leave it user for now. Microsoft's shared license terms, you can hide that from the user. It's obviously hidden from the user if they're not a user. So that's why it goes away, right? And then privacy settings. These are those settings that people have to choose, like this, when I'm going through. Choose privacy settings. I can say don't show it, just hide it, right? Hide account options, right? So you can either say options to change account and start over with a different account appear, right? That wouldn't be the case. You could say hide that from them if you're in a regular user-driven enrollment. That goes away when you go to hardware-driven because it's already known. It's a hash. It knows that device. It knows who it's signed to, and it knows who it's going to. And then user account type is going to be, are they an administrator or are they standard user? The downside about hardware-based deployment right now is it only can make non-administrators, because in Microsoft's wisdom, they're like, we don't give local admin to people. You're fine. Except for we probably do in a lot of cases, right? Because that's what we've had to do to survive as MSPs. But it is a bad practice from a secure and protection. It's in CIS controls. It's a primary control there, not to give users admin access. So yeah, and then you can set a language region. So if you are multinational or in global space, you can set other languages for that. So if you had a specific group, Eastern European group, that would get the Eastern European settings if you set that, so in that way. So we're going to use this. We're not going to automatically configure keyboard. Yes, we're going to leave the language region default of the OS. The challenge with default of the OS is if you have multi-languages in there, that can be weird too. So, you can just set that to English if you know it's going to be English or American, US English. And then apply device name template. So what we can do is, for the purposes of, if you remember, we said we could do dynamic groups that are based on name. You could also say, hey, if you're Matt, or if you're this device assigned to Matt and you come in, I want it to be named something that I can then use that name that gets resulted out of that to have it filter into other groups and get other policies applied that are basic to that user. So using something like this where you're like, I think it's like, isn't it just serial number? Yeah, % serial. So you could say ICT dash lap or dash lap dash % serial %. And then what it'll do is it'll actually pull the, of course, thank you. Yeah, we'll just Matt, ICT, fine, screw you. Net BIOS still persisting, right? The length of net BIOS names. And so it'll take a truncated serial number. So if you have an HP where it has a really long serial number, it'll truncate that serial number a little bit. If it's Dell, the character length is enough that it actually is within the net BIOS name, and so it'll just be the full serial number. It makes it easier when you're searching by serial if you do it that way. You use an asset tag, right, too, as well. It's not as directly attributed, and it can't grab that asset tag. So when you do the naming convention, you can't use it. So serial is what I like to go with, is mine. Also, ironically, if you do this in the Autopilot database later, you use serial a different way. But for now, they tell you right here in the instructions, right? You could add that or a random number if you wanted to do that. Yeah. So assignments to groups, included groups, and add all devices. So we're just going to say, did I make a device group for this? I think I did. Yeah. MEM devices. Oh no, I wanted you guys to see these getting converted into hashes. Bear with me. So all devices, you could scope it or you could not scope it, right? So you could have multiple different ones with different scopes. And did I check the convert? Oh, that's right. I'm gonna make two policies because you have to be user-based to convert, as I remember. Okay. Yeah, great, thanks. This one is, and that's already user-based. So then I'll just modify this one. Device-based, Matt, delete. And then this is the, no, I already did that. I'm sorry, guys. Told you you'd see me fail. Self-deploying, so either would have worked. Okay, so we're going to specifically, and I'll go move some devices in that group so we can see what we're trying to see here. So now we have an autopilot deployment profile that's set up for device-based when we have a hash or that device is in a group that we can use. And then the default, which is what we just would see with the user-based. And I don't think the default does convert devices. Yeah. So in this setting, whoever set this one up didn't set it up to convert everything out of Azure Active Directory that falls in scope into a hash and put it in the Autopilot database. That's why that database was completely blank. So when we go to the Autopilot database, which is database number 2, as I've referenced it, it is here. And then devices, this is the database 2. We'll notice there's nothing in this device. And the reason is, even though I brought this through user-based, there was no policy saying convert it to an Autopilot device. So what you'd ideally want is an enrollment page that does convert those devices as they come into that group so that you have a hash. And so if that device ever gets reset, it's now a hardware-based deployment. Right? So the first time the user has to sign in, potentially, if you don't have the hash. But then afterwards, you've built a list of hashes. So what I want to do, and we'll see if Azure will play along with us, is I want to go add some devices to that device group. And maybe my new device, desktop dash whatever, will be here that I can select. Let's see. Burp. See if I get lucky. It's one of these. Probably. There's an Azure delay, but this will take and start converting these devices and determining whether they have a TPM 1.0 or a TPM 2.0, and it'll elicit that when we get back to the Autopilot database here in a minute. So we should start seeing devices get converted over. You can sync. So if you notice you have last sync request 11:11 a.m. 9:17, that is kind of indicative of this being another database, right? This is the separate database. So we're going to go sync and ask it to sync those devices I just put in that group, and hopefully we'll get some device data here. So let's shift back to our laptop that's